You're tuned into the Unnecessary Harm podcast, where we drill down on issues of substance use and its cultural impact. Your host, Shane Varcoe, Executive Director of the Delgado Institute, with over 40 years' experience in youth and community work and a passion for building resilience.
Welcome back to the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Good to have you with us again this week. Very recent headlines peeled. Leading lawmakers gathered in Melbourne to discuss family violence crisis. It's a national disgrace and it's time we do something about it. There is no doubt it is getting worse. We are seeing data that high-risk family violence filed in our courts was thought to be around 38%, but it's more like 60%. The statement's coming from the first round table of the Federal Circuit and Family Court of Australia. The Delgado Institute has been actively monitoring this long but worsening phenomena. And whilst the stats are shocking, what disturbs us more is what's being done to worsen and even hide this terrible reality. The siloing of violence from alcohol and other drug use and the often behavioural atrocities these, if not facilitate, then intensify, is not merely an act of cognitive dissonance, rather appears almost protective of some of the vociferous minority of drug use promoting activists whose agenda is to liberalise greater substance use in our culture. We've been watching this for about 10 years and it's quite disturbing. The correlation between greater and greater permission models for substance use and the consequently growing demand for these models these models precipitate is no doubt adding to the crisis of family violence and neglect. Excuse me. Very new and leading edge research from the Journal of American Medical Association has revealed what's called the T factor, the thrive factor, for the very early years of a child, birth to 3 years of age. Despite varying levels of prenatal social disadvantage, the T factor, composed of positive environmental stimulation, nutrition, neighbourhood safety, positive caregiving, and child sleep. I wonder how substance use of any kind contributes to these imperatives. Our guest today is no stranger to this arena, and her depth of not only academic wealth, but her significant coalface experience have given her a hard-won and profound insight into the issues surrounding family violence, abuse, and neglect. Karen has more than 20 years' experience working in child and family services. This has included a number of roles within the Victorian Statutory Child Protection Program, including Specialist Infant Protective Worker, High-Risk Adolescent Consultant, and leadership roles. She has worked for a number of universities, researching curriculum, developing and lecturing in human services, policy and practice, including child protection, youth justice, disability services, family violence, and Indigenous and culturally diverse welfare services. Karen's PhD focused on professional ethics, where she argued that Aristotle's virtues ethics provides a useful framework for child protection practitioners to draw from as they seek to practice effectively, ethically, and exercise good professional judgment. Karen has authored and co-authored no less than 24 academic papers and is currently a board member of the Drug Advisory Council of Australia. There's a mouthful, but hey, Karen Broadley, Dr. Karen Broadley, welcome to the Unnecessary Harm podcast.
Thank you, Shane. Great to be here.
Yeah, a remarkable journey, and I know I've been privy to some of that over the years. We've intersected in various occasions in your vocational journey. I'd argue more than just a job for you. It is indeed a calling that you've pursued, and it's really great to have you with us today to discuss this kind of concerning issue and obviously developing issue. But look, for the sake of our listeners, obviously we've got a bit of history and that's great, but for the sake of our listeners, I want you to share some of the journey, particularly in the human services space, and your comprehensive work with families and children, clearly. Where did it kind of start for you and how did it evolve, Karen?
Yeah, thanks, Shane. And firstly, before I speak to that, thank you so much for having me and talking with me. And I was really interested in your introduction. Great introduction. And the thing with this field and the research and the evidence, it's ever evolving. things are changing, but some things never change, which is, interesting. So you asked me about my background. So I started as a youth worker about 30 years ago, 35 years ago.
Wow.
And
So what,
I had
you
a
were
real
12?
heart. Sorry?
So you were 12, were you?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. I should have said that. Yes. So I started a long time ago doing youth work, worked for a couple of community organisations, really learned a lot and grew a lot myself when I worked with young people in a Parkville Youth Residential Centre. And a lot of the young people in there were also clients of child protection, or had been clients of child protection. So they'd suffered child abuse and neglect, suffered trauma. We know now that, in the US, they call them crossover kids. We call them dual clients in Australia. But it's just this knowledge that we have now that many young offenders have been involved with child protection or are involved with child protection, have been in out of home care and have histories of trauma. Also, the young offenders that I work with, many of them had drug and alcohol addictions. Nearly every young person I worked with for a period of about 3 or 4 years or 5 years, I think it was, have used heroin and were addicted to heroin.
Wow. Okay.
From there, I moved into child protection and worked at child protection for over a decade, and worked with families and still young people, teenagers, but then also families with infants, newborns. So running meetings in hospitals, major hospitals, to talk about the parents and some of their struggles and addictions and the newborns, and making decisions about the safety of those newborns. Could they go home with their parents? And were we satisfied?
That's a tough call.
Could be
That's
safe?
a tough call.
Yeah.
Wow.
Really, really tough. And some of those parents had, again, addictions, heroin addictions. It's interesting when you think about child protection and even out of home care. I just had a very quick relook at the data before I came to talk to you. And there's a 2016 journal article, which is not as up to date as I'd like it to be, but still at that point in time, it said that between 60 to 70% of Australian children in out of home care have a parent with a substance abuse disorder.
Oh, that's staggering. And that's obvious. I think that's got worse since then.
I
would argue that.
Yeah. So this is back in 2016, yep. 60 to 70% substance abuse disorder. And at this point in time, we have about 46,000 children in out-of-home care across Australia.
That's staggering. So that's absolutely staggering. And if you apply that statistic, let's use that specific percentage, 60 to 70%. Let's go with the lower, 60%. You're looking at about 30 to 32,000 of those kids are actually out of home care, out of familial structured home care because of substance use.
Correct.
No wonder this data is being hidden. I'm going to chase this later on, but let's go back to your journey. So so this kind of let's keep going on this. But you talked about the substance use of your minors, the charges that you engaged with, and obviously based on that statistic you've just shared with us, some of that substance use would be informed by familial settings, parents using, but how. Yeah, but that in itself creates, as we know from the data, which I won't drill down into right now, we know from the data when a substance using parent's in play, then the likelihood of a child using substance is huge. And not just because of the modelling and the mimicking, but because of the neglect and the abuse. So it's a double whammy sword. And so trauma-informed drug use by kids, how would you see that in the settings you've been involved with? What sort of trauma specifically, other than what I've just talked about, would inform drug use for a 13, 14-year-old?
Well, I think role modelling, like you've mentioned, is a big thing, particularly with the children and teenagers that start using when they're very young.
Yeah.
When they start using when they're 11, 12, 13 years old, then that's not coming from peers. That's not coming from other places for the most part. That's coming from family.
Absolutely.
And this is the same really with offending generally. And I was looking at some research into not so much drug use, but just youth crime recently. And there are two groups of young people who get involved in youth crime. There's this group of young people who are very young, 11, 12, 13-year-olds, and they are the ones that have these sort of multiple vulnerabilities, multiple and complex needs. And they come from backgrounds of trauma, child abuse and neglect, which causes trauma. And they're involved with child protection, and many of them are in out-of-home care. So they're a very different cohort to the other type of young offender that starts offending when they're 17, 18, 19. And, you know, those older young offenders tend to be more peer influenced, and it can tend to be more short-lived, which is good.
Okay.
And they realise what they're doing. You know, they get a bit of a wake-up call and they get off that road
Yeah.
and get onto the straight and narrow again. So, yeah, when you ask about the trauma, it really displays itself in these very young people, children, primary school sometimes, and they're starting down this road of, you know, I've worked with young people who started using heroin when they were 11 or 12. And unsurprisingly, their parents used heroin. And their parents were, you know, had all of these complex needs going on, drug-related crime and, you know, mental health issues and so many other issues. Yeah.
I think it's interesting. Maybe I'm stating the obvious for the listeners, but the modelling dynamic is a very clear one, and obviously we understand from even just that little snippet from JAMA around the T factor. You know what's involved, what's needed for a child to thrive at a very early age, and those inventory of those very short little snippets, which we all, from a functional perspective, you know, even 25 years ago, we would take those for granted. This is what a child needs. Now we know that for all sorts of reasons, and many, out of the control of the individual, you know, the social determinants of substance use, you know, poverty, you know, cyclical poverty, unemployment, a peer factor. But this issue of familial perpetuation is a real concern, and the issue that when it comes to, which we'll drill down to a little bit later on, is the idea that we don't address the familial context. We tend to often, obviously you can't actually go in and do a remedial work with a family that doesn't want it, and the child's at immediate risk. That child must be extricated from that environment for their own safety, and that's something as you've indicated, you don't want to do. And I used to work in child protection from the other end. I worked in short and long-term residential care units with a department, and watching that phenomena at work, and having a 3-year-old in my care who's taken out of the home because of rape.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, when you have that kind of that toxic, shockingly toxic environment, of course, removing the child is the best practice. But what happens to that child when they're outside of a sound familial relationship, caring, nurturing, consistent guardianship? It creates this ongoing problem. Of course, substance use is a self-medicating exercise, and then it becomes a trauma-informed exercise, not just a modelling one. But going back to some of your journey in that child protective services, and I'm not interested in horror stories here, Karen. That's not, we're going to be looking at that at all. We could tell those all day long. But just want the listeners to get a bit of a feel, if you can, of course, please. If it's not too difficult for you, I know you're a seasoned professional. What are some of the you see the complexities, and we talk in those academic terms, but what are some of the really gut stuff that just you think, oh, this could be so easily fixed if?
Right.
What are some of the things that you were sensing and feeling during those journeys?
Right. Look, I think some of the most heartbreaking situations I was involved in was certainly the families where there were newborns and those meetings, those hospital meetings, and then what happened in the weeks and months after that. And one of the things that has occurred to me many times over the years is that, if these parents that I'd spoken with in these meetings, and often it was only the mother, but not always. But if they had been given an option to go to detox rehab with their baby, and I will just say there are hardly any beds across Australia, rehab beds for families. It's hard to get into rehab anyway if you're a single adult. But if you're a family, there really isn't much around. So obviously they never did. There was no situation that ever happened that I was involved in or knew of where a parent or parents were offered a bed in a rehab as an alternative to their child, their baby, their newborn being placed in out-of-home care, in foster care. There was never that option.
Yeah.
And, when you look at a little bit of research around this, like pregnancy and childbirth is a window of opportunity. It's that time when a parent will go, okay, I really don't want my child to live the sort of life I've lived. I want something different and better for my child.
Perfect.
Yes, I will take up the option to go into rehab. The other important thing to say there too is that I know some people will say, well, there are other drug treatment options, and there are other drug treatment options
Sure.
other than detox and rehab. But then we come to this added complexity where a lot of people who have drug addictions or dependency issues have other needs. So it's connected to, like, for example, in the child protection research, we talk about the toxic trio and the fact that many families come into modern child protection systems these days, and this is true in the UK, in the US, in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, they have multiple and complex needs. And the toxic trio is when a family or an individual has family violence, mental health issues, and alcohol and other drug issues. Those are the three, the toxic trio. Interestingly, I was talking to a friend of mine only a month or so ago, and she's a family violence. She studied family violence. She teaches about family violence. She talks to government and businesses about family violence. And she said, and we started talking about it, and she said, Karen, I know, we call it the dark triad.
Oh, wow.
So call it what you like.
Wow.
The dark triad, the toxic trio.
Yeah.
And it frustrates her, interestingly. It frustrates her that when there is talk, it's like you mentioned at the beginning, Shane, when there's this talk about family violence and gender-based violence, which is real and it's serious, and it does certainly seem to be getting worse. What is often missing from that story and the messages is that substance abuse, alcohol and other drug use is a factor. It's not always a factor,
I understand.
but it's definitely a risk factor. And so then going back to what I'm saying about families and newborns and being offered a bed in rehab, there not only need to be family places, there need to be places that treat people's needs holistically and not silo them off and say, well, you've got a drug and alcohol problem, but you've also got a mental health problem, so we can't help you. Or you've also got a family violence problem, so we can't help you. Or you've also got an acquired brain injury or some sort of disability, so therefore we can't help you. We need to treat whole families and the whole of their needs holistically. And this means also being mindful of the children in the family. Maybe there isn't just a newborn. Maybe there's 2 or 3 other children of different ages and they've experienced some abuse or trauma. They've experienced some challenges. So it's looking at the whole family and the whole person. But our government, look, I work with someone who used to work in alcohol and other drug services, and he said to me recently that he left the service he was working for. It was in regional Victoria. He left because it closed. So his experience over the past handful of years is that these services are closing. So funding and service availability is actually getting less, not more.
Yeah.
It's a tragedy.
Yeah. No, and I think that the perfect storm's in play. I mean, let's go back to well, as I mentioned in our opening, we're watching as a Delgado Institute specifically focuses on alcohol and other drug use from a prevention, demand reduction, and we work closely with the recovery alumni. So we're all about building fences of protection at the top of the cliff rather than driving the ambulances. We're not saying ambulances are not necessary. They are, but what we've done now is we've torn down the fences in culture, and even relating to some of your studies in ethics and whatnot. We've torn down those fences, and then we said, look, we'll just let people do what they want, and we'll try and clean up the mess later. That's a failed model. Not failing, it's failed.
Yeah.
And damage management, I heard someone constantly say to me over the years, and not without accuracy, and I met with the then Chief of Police in New South Wales, Scipione, about 10 years ago, and he even said, and he was very anti-drug, he said, well, Shane, we're not going to arrest our way out of this problem. Yeah. I said to him, yeah, but Mr. Scipione, we're not going to treat our way out of this problem either. And so we've got to have a really seriously look at a collaborative approach to this. Now, it's interesting you talk about the going back to that moment, that opportunity of and a window to engage in a better place, particularly for women. And of course, we've had a bit of experience in that space. And one of the women we interviewed for our I Wish I Never drug and alcohol program, we had some real life interviews with current and recovering addicts, and it was interesting to listen to her narrative as a rebellious teenager. She wasn't necessarily trauma informed. She grew up in a home that was perhaps a little neglectful. She was one of 6 kids. She was a little bit feral. At 15, left home and joined the bikie gang. And of course, she was then traumatized well and truly as a result of that engagement. But it's interesting. She said, I was mainlining heroin, speed, doing everything, living large. I found out I got pregnant, Shane. I found out I got pregnant at 17. And she said, you know what? For the life of me, for 4 years, I couldn't stop using. I got pregnant. I stopped using instantly.
Right.
I said, I'm not going to do this. And for 9 months, Shane, she said, 9 months, I was completely clean. Everything. As soon as the baby was born, I'm back on the gear. But that was interesting to listen to her. So the reason I brought that up is that if she had had an opportunity to go into a therapeutic community that gave care for her and a child, would have been a huge option. And we also work with the recovery sector and groups like, for example, Teen Challenge, I think San Patriano in Europe and other groups they do have homes. In fact, in Australia, there's two. I think there's two that have homes specifically therapeutic communities for women and children, understanding that women need to have their children with them in rehab to actually do this well. So those kind of environments are very powerful. But you're right, again, funding for that is almost non-existent. And the capacity to sustain that kind of model is very real. And it's actually affordable compared to a lot of the other operations in play, because a lot of these organizations do this on a not so much volunteer, but it's a not-for-profit sector. They can do it at a very low rate and high-quality evidence-based treatment. But yeah, I think this is where the government's got to get away from this siloing. Now, I want to tip back into that triad of darkness, that toxic trio. I think that's a really good one we're all aware of, because I also mentioned in our opening to our listeners again that we've been watching the collapsing of drug use, alcohol and other drug use data and its impact and its outcomes collapsing into the mental health space. Happened about 2015-16. Going back to your little disclosure there from the data you looked at, that's when we noticed it disappeared from the recording space. So we've been following this and watching this. And so I guess 10 years ago, this kind of disappeared. And were you aware, and again, the siloing issue, I understand it to a certain extent, but the idea is that drug use is a mental health problem. It can become a mental health problem, and mental health can facilitate drug use. No argument there. We've seen that.
Yeah.
But also, we know from data, from the uptake data, between 44 and 72% of first-time drug users in our culture are not trauma-informed drug users. They are doing it because a friend offered it to them, or they're curious. So it's a party arrangement, and that's what we've been seeing the last 15 to 20, particularly the last 15 to 20 years. There's more and more this hedonic engagement with substance use. It's fun. I can get away with it. It's okay. And that obviously creates a problem, because substances are idiosyncratic, and a dependency and a graduation to addiction and, ultimately other areas can be real. So did you notice, or were you aware of in your journey, although you work in child protection, did you see that or notice that scenario emerge where the drug data disappeared and mental health all of a sudden was the catch-all for everything?
The only thing I noticed, and it is interesting, this 2016 stat that I just told you, 60 to 70%, because in child protection, data is collected about the families and the characteristics of the families that come into contact with child protection. There's been this ongoing, I suppose, debate, discussion within child protection. So, there are some people that look at children and their involvement with child protection and the families, the parents, and they want to sort of count the drug use. They want to measure the drug use. Is there drug and alcohol use? Whereas others will say, no. It's not about the drug use. People can use drugs or alcohol and still be very good parents. So it's not about the drug use per se or the alcohol use. It's about how does that impact their parenting. So therefore, if we're going to count things, we will count what it impacts, not it itself. If that makes sense.
Yep. No.
So then you find, and I can't remember this article, but I remember looking at a more recent article where the writers deliberately said, we're not going to count drug use. We're going to count the parenting problem, which could be caused by drug use or it could be caused by a range of other things. So I think there's been this shift in thinking, in ideology, in wanting to say, well, it's not drug use that's the culprit, because some parents can use drugs and be a very good parent. There are researchers, particularly, there's a couple of researchers that I quite like. I think they're Scottish researchers. Neil McKegney, I think his name is, and Maria Barnard, I think her name is. and they've written quite a bit in this space.
Yep.
And one of them, I remember, I think I've got the book somewhere. She said, there is this sort of never-ending claim that people can be very good parents, use drugs, but still be very good parents. But she said there's no evidence to that.
No.
You're trying to evidence something that's sort of you don't know about, because if they were very good parents, how would we even know? They wouldn't be telling people they're using drugs, and they wouldn't be coming to the attention of the police or child protection services. So how do you know? How do you evidence something like that? And indeed, we have no evidence for it. We don't have a sample of heroin users or daily cannabis users who have babies and young children who are good parents.
That's right.
They're very
Look,
hard to
he's
recruit.
an outstanding model. And in fact, I think if you found one, that'd probably be an exception that proved the rule.
But even if they were the rule, Shane, how would you find them?
Correct.
How would you ever know? I don't think they do exist. I agree with you. But you can't actually, like, if you think it through, how do you find evidence for this? Well, you can't, and there is none.
Well, I'm glad you raised that up, because I think that's where it's really fascinating. Because again, if you want to hide, and I'm getting very cynical here in my approach, not because I'm anti-drugs, or in fact I'm pro-people. I just see what this stuff does and how it unravels. And in fact, I've watched it happen in my own family with my brother, and see what it totally unraveled him, and failed marriage, couldn't parent properly even if he tried. Again, so it's interesting that when I'm talking to current drug users who believe themselves to be a functioning drug user or a functioning addict, again, it's a myth. It's one of those. It's the abominable snowman. It's the Yeti. It's this kind of thing. Now they pay their taxes, they go to work, they show up, but when it comes to raising children effectively and well in the thrive zone, it's interesting now when you juxtapose that reality with, for example, child protection, which was introduced recently when it comes to institutional care. When you have child protection rules like we just did, training in areas where when you have to be involved with.
Hey people, just wanted to give you a heads up about a fantastic podcast you should check out. Pathways to Prevention is an inspirational podcast about the best practice journey of substance use prevention and many of the key factors that just make life work better. For in-depth, engaging and exceptional interviews and content, just search Pathways to Prevention podcast. That's Pathways, 2, Prevention, and check it out. Now back to Unnecessary Harm.
Looking after children and families, and what expectations there are, what safety protocols, working with children checks, with safe environments, what do you report, what you don't report. Yeah. And in all of those reporting mechanisms, substance use is seen as a risk factor and a warning factor. So it's interesting. Hang on a minute. So if drug use is involved in any parental and or child setting, automatically, according to the legislation in place, that is a huge risk factor that needs to be reported and acted upon in an institutional context.
Correct.
But when it comes to the family, look, I'm a functional drug user, and all my little drug using group mates come together and put on our Facebook faces and say, we're doing okay, Jack, we're doing fine. Our children are okay, but by what standard?
Agree. And also, Shane, I think there's this sort of there's a disconnect between academia and the sort of the politicians and the talk, the modern talk about some of these issues and the reality on the ground for child protection workers, because the reality is, and certainly was the last time I was there, child protection, and I'm sure it's still the case, if a report is made to child protection and a parent is using, say, heroin, then that will be investigated. Like, it's a risk factor. And on the ground, they know it's a risk factor. They know it's concerning. So these cases are investigated. And even cannabis. I've been involved with families where the parents use cannabis every day. And the reality is, child protection workers, certainly when I was there, that there was a view that is concerning. So there's this disconnect between what's going on the ground and what people know to be true and factual on the ground, and sort of this other stuff that's sort of just the spin.
Yep. And I think that's where it becomes problematic, because now we've got people in various echelons of society, and we got to be very careful how we tread here, that engage in substance use for recreational purposes, right? And now we know that the red, what's called in certain sectors, the red wine of the illicit drug set is cocaine. It's very expensive to get. Australia is one of the biggest destinations for traffickers because we pay a lot of money for it. And, of course, the biggest users are the high professional sectors. We now know in the legal sector, the accounting sector, they're the ones, and a lot of it is often for, for staying awake. And right, the poor man's, if you like, the cask wine of the drug set is crystal meth. Now, both of these are high-level stimulants. We don't go into all the ins and outs of how they operate and the biomechanical operations of the human body and brain, but they cause all sorts of issues. Now, of course, we know with substance use it's idiosyncratic, and anything that stimulates and, of course, reduces the impacts, the GABA hormones in the brain, which is your restrainers, if you like, the brake of the brain. Yep. Let's use simple language. You take the brake off and you hit the accelerator. Whatever's going on in that person's world at that time, if they're a happy-go-lucky, everything's nice and sweet and light, they'll just be a high-level, jacked up clown, right? But if they're depressed or angry or frustrated, all those emotions are intensified. Now, we spend a lot more time on this. We haven't time to do it. So when it comes to substance use, these kind of substance uses, we see the potential for intensity, for longevity, for ferocity of substance use. We're not saying that and I get the point where a lot of women have said, I don't want my husband or my partner blaming alcohol for his violent behaviour. And I concur with that. But to excise alcohol from that equation is to the detriment of the family and the detriment of the community, because it is a factor. And substances, illicit substances, as I mentioned, like stimulants. But the other thing I wanted to bring, that's why I brought those two up, but what's scary, crystal meth and cocaine can get you wired pretty quick, but high-end THC, high-level THC cannabis, now high-end, again, I want to reiterate that, high-end THC content cannabis now leads the race in transitioning, this is all research, evidence-based data, leads the race in transitioning a temporary psychosis to a permanent psychotic order more than any other drug. In fact, double that of LSD, this high-end THC. So when you see people, we did some work with the health union, Australian Health Workers Union, on because they were dealing with hospital admissions and whatnot, and they saw all these things happening. And, of course, crystal meth was a clear problem in that. But then they noticed the crystal meth was going down, but they're still getting cases of this coming in. And they weren't aware that this is high-end THC. It is a psychosis-inducing product that can send people nuts, completely nuts, and violent and aggressive. And so they're dealing with this, not knowing that it's actually cannabis that they're dealing with. So that's really concerning and because now cannabis is one of the most engineered plants on the planet. It's not the weed that God invented. That doesn't exist anywhere. It's gone. It's been so engineered now with THC levels jacked up. And, of course, to do that and get that intensity happening, other cannabinoids have to be reduced as a result. So CBD is driven down as a result to increase that impact. So, again, we go into the science of this without being too academic on it. But this is the concerns we have. And what we're seeing happen now is people trying to grapple with this. So you've got hospital workers, and in fact, I was just recently had to go get some x-rays done for my knee, and I was asked by the radiologist, and I'm quoting now, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" I said, I was very timid about it. I said, "Look, I work in alcohol and other drug space." And he immediately blurted out, this is a radiologist, he blurted out, he said, "You know what? If alcohol and other drugs didn't exist, half of our work would disappear straight away, overnight." So, I mean, I've heard that before. That wasn't the first time I've heard that. I've got people in the police force, and they said to me, "Listen, if illicit drugs and alcohol weren't in the marketplace, I'd be out of a job." I would be out of a job.
Yeah.
So that's what they call anecdata. So it's not quite evidence-based, but it is powerful representations of what's being manifest and what your workers are seeing. So for me, when children are in this space, when in the end of the day we drill down to all this and we peel back all these layers of, my life, my rights, my whatever, the faux rights of, autonomy and that they bang on about, it's my human right to do with my body as I want. Yeah, but it's not your human right that your body then acts out and does harm to others around you, or the neglect or abuse of those in your orbit, because that doesn't make you more human. It makes you less human.
Agree.
But the thing that concerns me most is that children are not considered, even though we've got all these child protection laws, they're not considered in this space when it comes to these different advocacies for more drug use. Now, I just want to switch a little bit here. What do you see from your, if you can notice it at all, what do you see from your perspective? How the constant, the last 10 years particularly, this constant push to greater liberalisation of drugs, decriminalisation, legalisation. The Greens now want to legalise cocaine as well as cannabis, not just decriminalise it, but legalise it. How do you see that playing out as a driver, even though the things aren't happened yet and may not happen, as a driver for engagement with substances? And how does that ripple effect work on families?
A couple of things. First of all, I think even as you were talking before about all of those impacts of those various drugs and how dangerous they are, and you were talking about, this idea that, some people use, and they're professionals, and they use various drugs. I think, when you think about the fact that, if trauma is in there, and trauma is a big thing, because people, not every drug user, not every cannabis user gets a substance abuse disorder or cannabis use disorder. But if you've got a history of trauma and you're self-medicating because you've got distress and post-traumatic distress and so many issues resulting from that trauma, then the risk of you developing a cannabis use disorder or any sort of substance abuse disorder becomes heightened. You're more likely to develop a problem if you've got a whole lot of trauma symptoms going on, and that drug is alleviating that, or seemingly so, certainly in the short term. So what occurs to me is that when people are pushing for decriminalisation and legalisation of drugs, they're only, and some of those people use drugs themselves. There's the Legalised Cannabis Party person in Victoria, Legalised Cannabis
surprise
party in Victoria, and you can look this up. I won't say names or anything, but on his parliamentary website, he talks about the fact that he has been a long-term cannabis Freudian slip there, user, a long-term cannabis user. And one of his key aims in being an MP, Victorian Upper House MP, is to legalise cannabis. Now, if he's, I don't know how much he uses. I obviously don't know any detail, but he might have survived okay. He might be using cannabis every week and has done so for years, and he might be surviving okay. But there are plenty of individuals out there who don't survive so well. They're more vulnerable. They've had vulnerable backgrounds. They've been victims of violence. They've been victims of violence when they were very young, which has then impacted on them in ways that many of us can't even imagine. And so therefore, cannabis and other drugs are the worst things that they would be wanting to get involved in. And so there's this, in this sort of, elitish type of thinking, there's this complete lack of consideration of vulnerable people, number one. And number two, included in that is a complete lack of consideration for children.
There it is.
And children's safety. I mean, there's solid evidence coming from countries, jurisdictions where cannabis has been legalized, Canada and Colorado and many, many more, around, for example, an increase in use by pregnant women when they're pregnant, and that then impacts on
Yes.
on the health
Yes.
and well-being, the safety of the unborn. And so they're more likely to be born preterm, small for gestational age, all of that. They're more prone to infections. They're more likely to die within the first 28 days after birth. And it heightens the risks for really poor outcomes for newborns if their mother uses cannabis. But that's increased since legalisation. The other thing that's been increased since legalisation, and many of these countries, is
Absolutely.
accidental overdoses by children, because children get into the gummies or the hash cookies or, the biscuits, and they think that looks great. So, and then they've overdosed on cannabis because their parents have had
The
their
edibles,
own plants and grow their own cannabis and make
Correct.
cookies and all sorts of other things. So there's just a lack of thought given to children. And even in Victoria, I mean, we have our supervised injecting room in North Richmond, and they call it a safe injecting room. But, the people that go there, they're not your elite. They're not lawyers who go there. And this is demonstrated in the research. They're people, they're vulnerable people with multiple needs.
Yep.
They've got health needs. They've got mental health needs. They're homeless. They've got so many needs going on, and there are no services, that will treat their needs holistically. We're celebrating when our statistics don't die, but we're not actually giving people the opportunity to have a life. But also, a lot of these people, they're adults. A lot of them will have children. So where are their children while they're walking down the street and going to the supervised injecting room? Are they leaving their baby at home? Have they lost their children? Many have lost their children into care or to relatives in some situations.
Of course.
So there's this with this push to accept and legalise various sorts of drugs or decriminalise. There's just this lack of consideration, abject lack of consideration or thought given to vulnerable people and children. Yeah.
I think that in itself is a clear indicator of a society that's in free fall. I mean, one of the fundamental tenets of Western culture is what they call the neighbour principle. So it's actually seminal to foundational law that you don't just live for yourself. You live in a context, and you have neighbours, and you are to consider your neighbour and your neighbour's well-being, not just your own. Now, once that goes out the window, and I would argue, and I've seen this time and time again from very direct personal experience, and in the work and vocational spaces, when people use drugs, the care factor disappears. Now, the DMT punters and the MDMA sycophants will tell you that, oh, no, you get more caring when you use these drugs. But the other side effects of that and the dissociative dynamics that can happen with those substance users create you a person that is not sound. And everyone who walks past a person in the street who's drunk and they're visibly drunk, nobody is comfortable with that. Now, we get used to it. You have to. But no one goes, oh, gee, let's walk past that person and say good afternoon. You wide berth that person because you do not know what can happen. So unpredictability, the care factor disappears. And, of course, then if you've got, as we mentioned before, some of those disinhibitors are removed, then what other factors are going to be unleashed in a psychosocial context? What is going to be released? What's going to be manifest? And if children are involved, they're going to be the ones that suffer the most. Of course, vulnerable others like women, for example, who are in situations like that. Oh, look, we know it goes the other way. There's there's something like 10 or 15% of violence of women against men, against substance use can be part of that as well. But when you've got those kind of measures in place, then all of a sudden the unpredictability, vulnerability, all those things increase. And again, trauma is introduced to that environment. Even if it's not physical abuse or sexual abuse, there is a fear, an anxiety injected into that space. There is a vicarious trauma that the kids can experience. And those things all add to framing that little child up. And the T factor's out the window, it's gone. And so that child is now in an environment not being nurtured, but surviving. And again, you said before about, it's interesting, our gold standard for drug use is now not, keep using, just don't die. That's the gold standard for drug policy. That's how dysfunctional drug policies become in this country. And when it comes to tobacco, of course, it's quit. One voice, one focus, one message in the marketplace, quit. But when it comes to illicit drug use, no. We have one voice, one focus, one message. It's keep using, just don't die. Keep using, just don't die. Keep using, just don't die. The cognitive dissonance is breathtaking. And I would argue it's a drug-induced cognitive dissonance, because only that kind of hypocrisy, only that kind of ridiculous ideology doesn't come from a rational space. And again, it's a misuse of language. It's a misuse of a very important principle and pillar of the harm minimization strategy, harm reduction, very important pillar. But it's a misuse of that mechanism to, I would argue, normalize drug use, not help people exit drug use, which was as always intent. Harm reduction is about assisting the person caught in the tyranny of addiction exit drug use whilst keeping them alive. If the exit drug use is not part of the equation, then all you end up doing is normalizing drug use, which is what we're seeing. And again, of course, with each normalization mechanism, the self-fulfilling prophecy, more people engage. And the more people engage, well, this is normal behavior. People want this. So then we start pushing. We've seen the last 6 years now, aggressive pushes in the parliamentary space to legalize substances, because that's the agenda. Now, it's interesting too, I wanted to throw in that comment you made before about the elites. I was dealing with a very high-profile international actor involved in San Patriano communities in Italy. There are therapeutic communities. You may or may not have heard of them. Our listeners would know, some of the listeners would know who they were. And there was a debate because one of the biggest pro-cannabis and pro-liberal drug users in the world is Richard Branson. And he's made no bones about that. He's funded and bankrolled large pushes to have international conventions shifted. And she had an open debate with him. And the comment you made before was fascinating, because he was talking about the foolishness of this problem. And he smokes weed with his son, and it's all very bonding for them. And she got up and she said, well, Mr. Branson, it's good for you, because when things go pear-shaped for you and your family, you can afford the $2,500 a day rehab to exit drug use. But what about people like me and the hundreds of thousands of people like me who have got no access to this kind of treatment, no access to the capacity to do this? And he basically shut him down in the public stage. Karen, Broadley, it has been wonderful having you here. Thank you for your candor. Thank you for your insights. And most of all, on behalf of our listeners, on behalf of many people, thank you for your long tenure in a very, very difficult arena. I have some experience there, and it's a tough space, and you are still standing, and you're standing with integrity. So I want to congratulate you on that, and thank you on behalf of our listeners. It's been fabulous. So until next time, stay away from harm, people. Stay away from unnecessary harm. Thanks for listening.
As we wrap up today's session, remember, each step towards understanding is a step away from unnecessary harm. We're here to empower, inspire, and pave the way for optimal well-being. Stay resilient, stay informed, and continue being the change your community needs. Thank you for joining us at the Unnecessary Harm Podcast. Until next time, take care and keep pushing forward.